it's a watershed event. This can be compared with the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., or imagine if in South Africa Nelson Mandela were to be murdered while in jail. But we'll see a very different reaction. Whereas in our country or in South Africa, there would have been an explosion of popular anger. In Russia, there's going to be none. Russia became, under Putin, and I was there literally with Angela and other colleagues meeting Putin many times in a framework called the Valdai Club. Once a year, we would go and meet with him, and increasingly we saw a man who controlled more and more of that society. Right. But also, the murder of Navalny not only highlights how totalitarian Russia is becoming, but that there's no other person of that stature to replace him. My good friend, Boris Nemtsov in Russian pronunciation, was murdered in 2014, also in February, 10 years ago.
Right.
And since then, Russia was decapitated. Russian opposition was decapitated. And Alexei was a very brave man, because after speaking up his mind, he was poisoned, as we remember, was flown to Germany, miraculously saved from the poison. And then he decided to go back and continue to fight.
Right.
And they just couldn't tolerate having him in jail. And I do believe that he was killed.
Ariel Cohen, this is just so important. And I think of a conversation with the giant Marshall Goldman. Yep. On air with Bloomberg Surveillance folks in tears, live from Moscow, the day where he said there was a shift and Putin took over. How do we respond, not to the Putin that Marshall Goldman knew on that day, but how do we respond to this modern Putin?
I think there is a real and present danger. I don't want to be overly dramatic and say it's a mortal danger. We heard 2 days ago the leak from Congress that Russia is deploying a potent anti-satellite weapon in space. Probably is going to violate the space treaty that prevents deployment of satellite weapons and nuclear weapons in space. I do believe Putin is preparing to broaden the war beyond Ukraine. And in the meantime, we're having a circus in Washington where a small part of the Republican congressional delegation, is articulating arguments they hear from Tucker Carlson and from Donald Trump, and try to appease Putin. We saw this movie in the late 1930s, and in 1940 towards another dictator in Europe, and it ended up in a world war.
Yep. Dr. Cohen, I think when we saw this news today about Navalny, a lot of us thought about the Wall Street Journal reporter there, and others that are being held there. Any update on how that might develop, that particular, because that's so high profile?
Putin is increasingly, as they say, costume playing the Cold War, and his two idols are Stalin and Hitler, believe it or not.
Wow.
You would think that any modern person would not keep Stalin and Hitler as his models for emulation. I think we may see an exchange of Ivan Gershkovich for a Russian spy somewhere in the equivalent of a bridge between the East and West Berlin.
Ariel, this is so important what you're saying here. How close are we to the middle 30s or the late 1930s? The language
I would say late.
The language from you on Stalin, on Hitler, and we're in Washington with a new isolationism that's extraordinary. Is there an analog to 1938?
Today, yes, I think we are. I think, God willing, it can be resolved, but the chances are going down. I think Putin made a decision based on his observation of America, of Western Europe, that we're weak, that we can be pushed around. And a late great Russian political consultant, Gleb Pavlovsky, whom I knew very well, who worked for Putin for many years and then parted ways with him around 2008, kept writing and saying to me personally and to others that the only way the Putin regime knows is escalation.
Yep.
And we see it. We see it in Georgia, in Ukraine in 2014, in Ukraine in 2022, in leaked war plans against the Baltic states now. And I think unless we restore our deterrence, the worst case scenario may play out in Europe.